Thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get this one started since I have a feeling we'll have a few things to talk about. I'm Tanvi Madan. I'm director of the India project at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Today we're going to discuss China, India, what is going on between the two countries, their relationship with each other, but also how this is seen by other countries in their kind of overlapping peripheries. As well as what this all might mean for Asia as a whole, but also the US, which has strong relations with both countries, but in different ways. I'm going to start by kind of going back to spring, when there was this story that came out with the Indian Defense Ministry announced that the Indian Navy, along with the Chinese Navy, had stopped a pirate attack, a Somali pirate attack, on a Tuvalu-flagged ship. And here was this sign of, this is how the two countries can work together to protect the global commons, the kind of story that for a number of years the leaders from both sides had talked about. Well, within 24 hours, this story took a very different narrative. Because the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement, or the Ministry of Defense statement that came out, mentioned that China had foiled this attack, and there was no mention of India. At which point, the Indian press decided that China was belittling India's role. So within 24 hours, this turned from a good news story to a bad news story. And this is somewhat reflective of the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years of the China-India relationship, where when Prime Minister Modi first came to office in May 2014, there was much hope on his part, but also in China, that this was a Prime Minister who was quite familiar with China, had visited 3 or 4 times as Chief Minister. This was going to be the dawn of a new, closer relationship, continuing from the previous few years and the previous 10 to 15 years, but also kind of building on it, especially economically. We haven't seen this play out. The last 2 years have been quite tense in the China-India relationship. And we're going to talk about some of those reasons why. Most recently, we saw a standoff between the two countries at Doklam or Donglang. And we're going to talk a little bit about why we are where we are, how this is seen by countries sandwiched in between India and China, and where we go from here. And I have a great panel with me. I'll start from my left, Ruan Zongze, Executive Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, Kanak Mani Dixit, who is founding editor of Himal Southasian magazine, and Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Distinguished Fellow at Brookings, as well as Chairman of the Institute for China Studies, and a former Indian National Security Advisor. I'm going to start with the standoff that took place starting in June, and which was resolved a few weeks ago. And this was between China and India in the Tri-Junction area in what, now the different versions of it, and we'll get to it, but what Bhutan and India say is disputed territory and was agreed as such between China and Bhutan. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Ruan. How was this seen in Beijing? Why did this standoff happen? And why do you think it got resolved the way it did?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great question, and it's a good point to start. Let me put it this way. I think this kind of a Doklam standoff, China was caught by huge surprise. Why? Because first of all, this part of the border, the second sector of China-India border, is not among those which contested area. Put it another way, there's no dispute at all. And in the no dispute in the past 127 years, we trace back to 1890, the treaty, and the consecutive government, India and China, both agreed that they clearly delimited the border. So what is the motivation for India to start to send its border troops trespassing to the Chinese side? This is number one. But all in all, I think I should put this kind of incident or this standoff in a broader context. That China and the India relationship is not a zero-sum game at all. And in the last couple of years, you have seen the mushrooming huge progress has been made between the two great neighbors. And the Chinese President Xi Jinping visited India, particularly in the Modi's hometown, and the vice versa, and Modi paid his visit in 2015 to Xi'an, which is the hometown of Xi Jinping. So it seems that two leadership cultivate a far better relationship than most of us thought. But all of a sudden, you have seen this saga happened. So why is the reason? I think two things is very important to mention. I think in the last couple of years, from Chinese perspective or my perspective, India has some apprehension about China's intention. For example, when China proposed the Belt and Road Initiative, India has been very, very skeptical about this intention, particularly when China is working with Pakistan and the economic corridor, and also with other South Asia countries. So I think from India's perspective, China is doing something not pretty positive on its neighborhood. However, from China's perspective, China has its own concern about India as well. For example, in the past, India is very proud of pursue a policy of strategic autonomy. Simply put, India is pursue a policy of long-line policy. However, in recent 1 year or two, we have seen India seems starting to abandon this kind of policy and to moving, for example, closer to American and others, for example, a feature on the military exercise, and very vocal on China, very vocal of this military exercise is target China or whatsoever. So I think there are some miscalculation and erupted. So this Doklam standoff, I think, is just one of the reflection of what happened very recently. Thank you.
Ambassador Menon, India sees the standoff site slightly differently, including whether or not the territory is disputed. Could you speak to, give us an Indian perspective of not the Indian perspective, but an Indian perspective, especially as somebody who was very much involved in the understanding that was reached on this particular tri-junction area?
Well, Doklam itself, I think the problem is not so much a question of the boundary line between India and China in this area. That, I think, we both agreed in the 1960s officials' talks as well. We both agreed where the boundary is. It's a watershed. The problem is where the tri-junction is and whether Doklam itself is Bhutanese or Chinese. And that's something that the two countries have to sort out between themselves. But overall, I think, I agree actually with Ran that Doklam is only one sign, one of multiple signs of stress in the relationship over the last few years. I mean, whether it's Masood Azhar's listing in the UN, whether it's China's attitude on India's membership of the NSG, and so on. There's a whole list of these. And for me, this stress comes from two or three things. One is, certainly, we've both got much more touchy about sovereignty issues. What China is doing, the CPEC under the Belt and Road in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which we regard as Indian territory, that becomes a sovereignty problem. But also, if you look at it, India and China have managed to develop this relationship over the last 30-odd years on the basis of a certain modus vivendi, where we would discuss the differences, the boundary question, the world's biggest boundary dispute. We would manage differences, and we would cooperate where we could, whether bilaterally, we grew trade from $2 billion to $72 billion, and on the international stage, whether it was, in the WTO, climate change, basic, etc. But that modus vivendi no longer suffices because our own definition of our interests has grown. I mean, my favorite example is the South China Sea. When we started reform in '91 for India, foreign merchandise trade was about 18% of GDP, and most of it went west. Now, by 2014, it was 49.3% of GDP. And most of that went east through the South China Sea. So suddenly, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea becomes an important interest for India. For China, in the meantime, the 9-dash line has been notified to the UN in '96. It's become a core interest after 2008. So you have a situation where we're both rubbing up against each other in the periphery that we share. I mean, our periphery is also China's periphery, and where our definition of our interests has grown as we have changed, and where we need to sit down and actually work out a new modus vivendi of how do we deal with the situation. I think it can be done, actually. I'm actually an optimist. I think on things like maritime security, I mean, after all, we both have an interest in securing the sea lanes through which all our energy comes out of the Persian Gulf, or where our trade flows. But we have a whole new set of issues, cybersecurity, things like this, which I think we need to sit and actually work out. What are our core interests? Can we manage our differences? And where can we actually work together? And I think we haven't quite done that, because the change has been so rapid, whether it's in India, in China, in the situation around us in the Asia-Pacific. A lot of that is also because of the uncertainty. What's the US going to do? What does the new administration do? So I think we're really at this sort of inflection point. I'm glad we handled Doklam like mature people. And we can still say that the last shot on that border was fired in 1975, and that was by accident. And that shows, I think, an ability to handle difficult situations. But I think, that's going to get harder and harder unless we sit and do this larger exercise for the relationship.
Mr. Dixit, in some ways, Nepal is kind of part of that overlapping periphery, but you could also see it differently, that it's in the center or in the middle of these two big countries. How did you see this standoff as it was happening in kind of Nepal's broader neighborhood, playing out between these two big Asian giants that Nepal is engaging with increasingly?
I think there's a major impact in not only the geostrategic but economic interrelationships that we had hoped would evolve in the days ahead, with India and China having a modicum of understanding, so that the Himalayan region actually becomes not a barrier but actually a connecting rod between East and Central Asia and South Asia. In that context, I would hope to speak not from a Nepal-based perspective, but a Himalayan perspective, and later, if there is time, the South Asian perspective. But just looking at it from a Himalayan perspective, the Himalayan region has always been regarded, since the days of the Great Game and earlier, as this massive geostrategic barrier. And that's how it was even till 1962, when the conflict happened between India and China. But over the last decade, especially with the arrival of the railroad from Beijing, through Golmud, the Xinjiang-Tibet railroad, arrived in Lhasa in 2002, arrived in Shigatse, which would be essentially north of Thimphu in Bhutan, in the Tibetan Plateau, in 2006. And it will be arriving northwest of Kathmandu, about 120 kilometers as the crow flies, into 2020. So all of this was indicating to us that, A, in these days of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Himalaya is not a barrier for a skirmish or a conflict. But more importantly, the economic, the vision of the Himalayan region as this massive barrier finally was about to break down, because on the northern side, there was railway, and there's the entire Indo-Gangetic plain, not just Nepal. The Indo-Gangetic plains is a big market to export and to import. So you expect that Nepal, as filling in about 800 kilometers of a 2,500 kilometer Himalayan chain, it's a substantial stretch of the Himalaya. So this area could actually be like an engine for trade and other kinds of activities, including people to people, not just for Nepal to benefit. That was the hope, that we are now within striking distance of such a goal. But what has happened is the Doklam crisis, it seems to me, unless, as Ambassador Menon says there is a discussion around the table and a way out is found. Otherwise, it's almost as if the spring has gone right back to 1962. Because what the 1962 conflict did, at least south of the Himalaya, in the Indian sphere and in the Indian psyche seems to be, created a paranoia in relation to the Himalayan chain, in terms of regarding it as a strategic barrier, that is a safeguard. And that, regarding the Himalayan barrier as a safeguard by the Indian nation state, means that it makes Nepal vulnerable, because its territory, therefore, is regarded more than just a neighbor of India, but also a buffer and a barrier. For this reason, I think that we have taken several steps back with the Doklam crisis, which I will not go into the whys and the wherefore about that. But one final point to add is that in the meantime, even prior to the Doklam crisis, over the last few years, China, for two reasons, has begun to see the southern side of the Himalayan divide as not necessarily an Indian sphere of influence. Since the time of Zhou Enlai, in fact, the Chinese leaders used to advise Nepal's leaders who came visiting that you have to keep in mind, all said and done, India, you are on the other side of the Himalaya. You are in India's sphere of influence. What has changed in the last few years for the smaller countries, mainly Bhutan and Nepal, of course, in this particular instance, south of the Himalayan divide, is that because of the rise in power and ambition of the Chinese state, as well as the arrival of infrastructure on the Tibetan plateau. For these two reasons, China seems to be looking at south of the Himalaya as also its sphere of influence, sorry, not as India's sphere of influence, but where it can also have legitimate interests in there. This is what has changed, and that is why the Doklam standoff, as it is called, has pushed everything back in terms of the ability of Nepal or of Bhutan, or perhaps some of the other states of India even, who may be wanting to take advantage of the opening to the north. That has been pushed back a bit.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in this point. So when we talk about China-India relationship, of course there is a bilateral domain. In the same time, don't forget the trilateral domain about it. Number one, China doesn't identify India as its rivalry, not at all. As a matter of fact, we identify India as a partner. And that's why China is positive about when India, under Modi Prime Minister, he has a narrative to play a leading role. China is supportive. And very recently, before the Doklam standoff, China supports India to be the member of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we had good cooperation in G20 and the BRICS and all those international arena. However, I think just now Ambassador mentioned India's periphery is China's periphery as well. When Modi Prime Minister came to power, he has a slogan to neighborhood first. So does China. Very coincident. The great minds may think alike. And, however, this neighborhood first, it creates some problematic from each side. When China reaches out to its neighbor, we regard Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, all our neighbors. You know how many neighbors we have? China border 14 net neighbors. 14 net neighbors. So they are naturally China's neighbors. So when China reach out to cultivate a better relationship, particularly in the name of the Belt and Road Initiative, that may generate or create some nervous in India. What China going to do about this? And Ambassador rightly mentioned about China-Pakistan economic corridor. For China, it is not a sovereign issue, but for India's side, it's a sovereign issue because of the Kashmir. China's position made it crystal clear. China take no position on the dispute of Kashmir. And the economic corridor, the project, does not affect China's policy on that in the future. So as long as India, Pakistan has agreement, China will respect to that. And the other thing interesting about Bhutan, about this Doklam standoff, yes, there's no dispute between that sector, the border sector, no dispute between China and India. However, Bhutan is the last country who did not normalize relationship with China. The only one remaining neighbor. We do not have a diplomatic or normal relationship. We know that the reason is quite obvious. India may have some very special influence on Bhutan. Then there is a question. Though we have the negotiation on the border, China and Bhutan on the border, it has nothing to do with India, be honest. It's China and Bhutan to sort it out. But why India jump in and say, I'll protect Bhutan in a way that that means prevent Bhutan from kind of bullying from China? This is quite strange for China, quite strange. It's China, it's a matter just between China and Bhutan. And basically, I don't think China and Bhutan has a dispute, that kind of serious disputes as we think. Because according to the tradition and the reality, China has a number of, over 20 rounds of talk about the border with Bhutan already. The Bhutan is very anxious, that very much like to reach to China for quite obvious reasons. So I think this kind of relationship, of course, sooner or later, China will establish diplomatic relationship with Bhutan. But that process, that effort may be misinterpreted as from Delhi. This is China's effort to undermine maybe Delhi's influence in its labor. I don't know. So all in all, I think there's a big problem between Beijing and Delhi. That is, we don't have much trust with each other. And each side view the other's action or the measures from a very skeptical intention, and vice versa. Not only India view China, but also in China view India. You mentioned about the South China Sea issue. That is the very, what happened in recent years. I understand very well, and Prime Minister Modi also not only look east, but also act east. So that's because of the growing interest of India. It's pretty natural. China doesn't have any kind of a veto for whatsoever. Number one, the freedom of navigation in South China Sea is not a problem until very recently. Who become a problem? American destroyer. American destroyer has a couple of accidents in this region. Apart from that, it is perfectly well. And also China is not just in general oppose the freedom of navigation, not at all. I think China does not oppose or reject the freedom of navigation in general. But what we reject is Americans' intentional provocation. However, for China, we also like to preserve the freedom of navigation in Indian Ocean. And China's large shares of its imports of oil and gas, 80% of China's imports from Middle East is passing through the Indian Ocean. So China also has a great stake in the freedom of navigation and the security of sea communication out there.
Thank you, Dr. Ron. Ambassador Menon, I want you to explain why India-Bhutan relations aren't strange, but also comment on, we've talked a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative that's been mentioned a few times. The Indian government did not send official representation to the Belt and Road Forum and issued a statement explaining why, including the kind of principles they'd like to see in connectivity initiatives. What are India's concerns about Belt and Road? And also, we've talked a little bit about the overlapping peripheries in the territorial part. But this aspect, which Dr. Ron just mentioned, which is the overlapping peripheries, or at least areas of activity and influence potentially in the maritime domain, do you see this? You said maritime security was going to be a cooperative space. But we have seen signs that there's not necessarily the same way of looking at it as well, and there could potentially be competitive spots there as well. So Bhutan, Belt and Road, and kind of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea.
I'm getting too old for this, because I'm old enough to remember when exactly the same arguments were made about Sri Lanka's, or Ceylon in those days, rice rubber pact with China. And there were all these, you should have seen the Indian media then, saying, look at this, China's in South Asia, what are they doing in the subcontinent? frankly, the fact is we've always had both a competitive and a cooperative relationship with China, and it's included elements of both. It's just that both of us now have capabilities which are much higher than they were earlier. And so, you know, I don't think the Himalayas have ever prevented this kind of, and frankly, I think the other countries in South Asia welcome this, because they're quite happy to come to us and say, look, the Chinese are giving us this, why don't you? And I'm sure they do the same to the Chinese. And if I were one of the smaller neighbors of both these countries, I would do exactly that. Why not? To maximize my own gain out of it. So I'm less worried about this, because I think it's something that works if we can manage it properly, which we have so far. I'm not so worried that somehow, you know, this kind of competition for friends or for development and so on is going to actually lead to some terrible result, some terrible outcome. I'm more worried when it comes to, as he mentioned, some of the more strategic aspects. The Belt and Road is one, where once it becomes sovereignty, and it becomes an issue that, in our case at least, it's about our territory and things, and 30,000 Chinese in Pakistan, that's a big commitment to the present status quo, which consists, in our mind, of Pakistan occupying our territory. That becomes a Chinese commitment, which is beyond just saying that, okay, it's between the two of you, you settle it. That's where the problem starts in our mind. And that's the kind of issue which actually, unless we sit and talk it through and find ways to deal with it, that's the kind of issue which can lead to trouble. Maritime, you know, in theory, maritime spaces are positive sum, because it's in every trading nation's interest to maintain freedom of navigation, to maintain security of sea lanes of communication. And unlike continental orders, which by definition are zero-sum, I mean, territory can belong to one or the other. It can't belong to both states. Whereas the maritime space is open. It's the use of it, and the use of it is actually in everyone's interest, which is why I'm more positive about maritime security, where I think you can actually talk about it, adjust your interests, and work together, unless one party has a territorial view of the oceans and starts treating it like it does territory, exclusive, only for my use, which I don't think is physically possible in today's day and age. But I do want to make another point. What's happened also in both countries is increasingly you have strong leaders who rely on nationalism for their legitimacy. And this is true of India, it's true of China, it's true across the region, across the world. What it does is it reduces the space for negotiation, for bargaining, for the normal business of diplomacy, for making the adjustments and the compromises. Doklam is different from previous crises, because we've had crises before, but we handled all of that quietly between the states. This time, if you read Global Times, you'd be petrified about what was going to happen. Same with the Indian media. I mean, but surprisingly, this time the Indian media was much quieter than before. But this is the problem. In an age of ultra-nationalism, where leaders feel that their ability to compromise, to make the adjustments necessary, to come to a good outcome is limited, then I think you've gotten to a more dangerous situation. So this is why I say we're in a new situation. We need to start looking at these issues and how we start dealing with this. And we can't just keep doing what we did in the past. You know, just telling each other, don't worry, I mean you no harm, don't worry, it's all going to work out fine, trust me. When there isn't trust, as you said, that's not going to work, and that's not enough. So I think you can do much more. I'm not saying this is going to be easy between India and China. I have one last point to make. I think part of the problem is the general uncertainty in the Asia-Pacific. We're functioning in a situation where, well, you look at the last 10 years, you've had a huge arms race. You might not want to call it that, but the fact is that you look at what's happened in the Asia-Pacific. You look at the shift in the balance of power. Nobody's quite sure where this is going. And it's a crowded geopolitical space. I mean, it's not just China rising or India, but Indonesia, Korea, there's established powers like Japan, there's new powers like Iran, for instance. So you actually have a situation, Vietnam, You have a crowded geopolitical space, very high uncertainty, and the risk that security problems, that the old system can no longer handle the security problems, whether it's South China Sea, Senkakus, whatever. I mean, these are North Korea nuclear. The old system can't handle it. A G2 doesn't seem capable of doing it either. So then what do? So because of that uncertainty, you're now handling India-China relations, sensitive inflection point, in an impossible sort of environment. That's where all the risks come from miscalculation, from somebody deciding, oh, maybe I have a chance to do something here, to change something. I can't speak for Bhutan. I can barely speak for India. So, I won't answer for what Bhutan does. But why does India have an interest in what happens in Doklam? Because as we agreed with China, actually, bilaterally in 2012, where that trijunction is something that all three countries will have to decide together. And who Doklam belongs to will depend on where that trijunction is. We, India, think it's at Batangla. China says it's at Gemochen, which is further south. And Doklam is actually north of that, or northeast of that. So it makes a difference. We also have obligations to Bhutan, but that is a different issue. Ultimately, as you said, the Bhutan-China boundary is something that Bhutan and China will settle. The India-China boundary in the Sikkim sector is settled as far as we are both concerned, but the trijunction is something the three of us will have to settle.
Mr. Dixit, both India and China during the Cold War very much kind of used superpower competition to gain maximum benefit from both parties involved. For countries in South Asia, this is a Belt and Road Initiative and kind of competing, India, or not competing, but other connectivity initiatives that are offering choice, like the Japan-India projects or the Indian projects alone. These are areas of opportunity. How does Nepal see these various initiatives or kind of promises from both countries or kind of even others? But also, is there concern about what we've seen in Sri Lanka, just in terms of kind of the debt, the terms of the debt, and the problems, some of the problems that has created in terms of long-term economic stability?
Well, let me answer your question by first going back to the Himalayan region, of which Nepal forms about half of the stretch. There was a time when the Indian state, any one of its entities, would breathe down heavily on Nepal not to build north-south roads, because that would be a strategic challenge for India. Those days are gone now. There is no attempt to block highways that Nepal needs in the north-south. What has changed now is that Nepal, following an economic blockade of Nepal in 2015, the Nepali Prime Minister reached out to Beijing. And actually what has changed on the ground is that there is now agreement between Nepal, Kathmandu and Beijing. 10 agreements. One of them is third country transit. One of them is trade, and other is infrastructure along this Himalayan barrier. Because interestingly, the Himalaya, you have to keep in mind, is it's not a plateau, it's a ridgeline. And at its highest, the high Himalaya as we call it, because Himalaya is made up of the mid-hills and the high Himalaya. The high Himalaya in the Nepal stretch, in most parts, is no more than about 40 miles wide. So as the crow flies, it's not long at all. So now there are actually formal agreements between Beijing and Kathmandu to open up to the north. And what Ambassador Menon just says, that the issue along the Himalayan frontier, if it is true that they can be sorted out, then Nepal looks forward to this kind of linkages. Now, talking about Bhutan just a bit, just because there is no Bhutanese representative here as far as I can make out, just that simply that Bhutan is now, earlier on it was much more of an autocratic state, or a kingship if you will, so that there was not much debate and discourse. Now actually there is quite a lot of discourse, as came out for the very first time during this whole Doklam crisis. There were voices of dissonance coming up from Bhutan that you wouldn't have found 10 years previously. Now, in the context therefore of north-south rapprochement, rapprochement possibly at least on the stretch of the Himalaya, if there were to be such a decision, if you keep out the CPEC, where I think that the Chinese were rather naive to be thinking that after taking your China-Pakistan economic corridor through what India considers as occupied territory, to think that India would then go along with BRI or whatever, that I think is a little naive. On the other hand, if you keep the Pakistan element outside and look at the rest of South Asia, including Nepal and Bhutan, what we look forward to, I think, is how does one take advantage of, either if there is assistance coming, grants, or financing coming along from both sides. I think each of the countries has been tackling with this issue. How do you balance India versus China, India and China? Sri Lanka has its ways, Bangladesh has its ways, and Nepal is trying to find its way because, frankly, Nepal is the least capable at this point to be able to do the balancing act because of its internal chaos that has continued for about 15, 16 years now. So perhaps in the next time round, I'll be able to tell you where Nepal exactly stands. But I can tell you that in general, what the neighbors feel, if I were to speak also for Sri Lanka and Bangladesh for now, is that we know the quantity of, we know what India means. And if there's some injustice done, I can, like during the blockade, I could write an article in the Hindu and take on the Indian state, so to speak. What do you do with China? We don't know China at all. So I think there's a need to rapidly understand how China has worked and dealt with Latin America, Africa, and Nepal to take notes from Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka to take notes from Bangladesh, Pakistan being a different category altogether, which we're not going to get into right now. So what I would see is that there's great opportunity, great possibility that economic growth can be ignited with the Chinese element in addition to everything else that we have with us. But as a Nepali commentator named Hari Sharma wrote recently, we know India, but we don't know China. So how do we understand China?
Well, I think this is precisely what is the Belt and Road Initiative all about. China wants to make a self-introduction to the rest of the world, particularly to our South Asian neighbors like Lipo. We are neighbors for so many years, but it's a kind of shock and a surprise. Say, my Nepalese friends know nothing or very little about China, and so does Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, all sort of ways. So we'll try to correct this, get it right. So that's why throughout all this initiative and the project, it's one of the best instruments to introduce who we are, what we're going to do. And if you are not happy or if you have some complaint, where do we go? Where do you go? I recommend China Daily, actually. He can contribute to China Daily in that way, because China Daily is a welcome foreign contributors to its press.
But yeah. Dr. Ron and Ambassador Menon, I want to ask about it, and then I want to quickly turn. But one of the areas, because we've seen not just the smaller countries in South Asia, China and India are barely connected. There are no daily direct flights between Delhi and Beijing to this day. It's a 5-day-a-week flight. There is no direct flight between Mumbai and Shanghai.
Tanvi, can I make a point just here? Because it's something we've been talking about. When while no one has been watching, Nepal, which has always been, the word is connectivity, right? Nepal has been fully connected historically with India. Right now, actually, in the last 4 or 5 years, Kathmandu is linked to 4 cities in India, and all of them are not daily flights, but there are 5 cities in China that Kathmandu is linked to daily today. That says something.
Yeah, I also like to share you a story. About 2 years ago, when India Foreign Secretary Swaraji, the Madam, she paid a visit to China, and the former Indian ambassador was holding a luncheon to invite some entrepreneur, businessman, although a few scholars to the embassy to have a roundtable discussing. I was one of the invitees, and she surprisingly asked the question, what India can do to improve its investment environment for you guys, businessmen, to come to India. And after those, my country businessman gives their voice. I told her, I said, you know, how many Chinese visit to India? I give a figure which everybody was very surprised. Over 2 years ago, more Chinese visitors go to Maldives. I'm sure many Chinese, they couldn't locate where Maldives is on that map. However, more Chinese visitors go to Maldives than go to Delhi. So I suggested to her that probably we can do something to facilitate the people-to-people contacts and the visit. I think you brought a very fundamental point, extremely important for us. We are neighbors, and in the past, China's knowledge about India is about 1,000 years ago when China's famous monk, Xuanzang, he traveled so long to India to learn. So in this kind of memories still come back and back again, but few people know what is happening now in India. And vice versa, I think many India, they don't know what is happening in China either. So I think this people-to-people, I'm a person very fond of this. So I like to propose greater interaction, and surely I think that both governments can do a lot. And we are two countries, over 1 billion people. 1 billion people.
We're going to...
2 billion. Almost.
We're going to turn to questions, and we'll start over here. I think if you could just wait for the mic, and please tell us who you are as well.
Hi, my name's Roma. Sir, you said that inherently that India and China had a basic distrust of each other in one of the comments you had made. And I think perhaps we should understand that. I understand, I don't know, I was too young, that maybe India feels, I don't know, you can explain to me that when China attacked in the middle of the night after making a treaty, in 62 or something, if you could explain that, and if you could explain why China distrusts India, and if we can find out why India, rightfully or not rightfully so, has these memories. And Nepal, unfortunately, has been stuck in the middle, being manipulated by both. But when you just mentioned that the problem started 16 years ago, 16 years ago there was a LAVAC event with the Chinese ambassador. And just that day, I had saw on CNN on the little ticker that there were Chinese militants starting riots and fights in Nepal. It was 16 years ago. So why do they distrust each other? Maybe if we figure out why we distrust each other, then we can move forward, because if you have this underlying distrust, you're not going to move forward.
So roots of distrust and historical baggage. Ambassador Menon, would you like to?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that picking at a scab is going to solve the problem. That going back and saying these are the roots of distrust, I think we have a new situation anyway. And I think what we need to do is to build for the future, look forward and see what we can do. Just like you said, I think, Tanvi, that we need much more to start understanding each other, where we are today and how we've changed. Because the kind of China, the kind of India that got into 62, that went through all that, no longer exists. And the whole situation is completely different. So I'm not so sure that that exercise is a very useful exercise today. Going forward, there's much more we can do. I mean, today there's what, 14,000 Indian students in China, studying all over, scattered over that country. There's nothing comparable in reverse. I mean, there's, tourism is minimal. There was a period when Indian tourism to China was growing very fast, about 4 or 5 years ago. But that seems to have tapered off, partly because of lack of flights. And there is certainly much more we can do. Chinese tourists to India, it's very small. There's some Buddhist tourism to the, and there's businessmen coming, but that's about it. There's not much else. So frankly, for me, those are the kinds of practical things we should be doing right now. And no amount of telling each other, trust me, I'm good, I mean you no harm, is going to solve this problem, except building habits of cooperation, of working together, and then of building up an experience of dealing with these things. I say this because we've actually done so. If you look at how we've kept the peace on a border, which is we actually have a huge dispute on where the boundary lies. We don't even have an agreement on where the LAC, the actual line of actual control, lies. But basically, we've maintained the peace and kept the status quo for 30 years together, both of us, because it's in our interest, not because of the goodness of our hearts. I would claim because we are so good, but that's not true. It's because we both feel it's in our interest. If we can do that, build on that common interest, we can then develop the experience and, I think, the habits of cooperation, which can ultimately lead to trust. I think that's really the way forward.
Other questions, and I'm going to club a few together. There's a question over there at the back, and then one here and there. So we'll take those four together.
I just need to clear one misperception of the lady over here, that she seems to have conflated the name Maoists, who did start an insurgency in Nepal in 2005, with China. There's not a relationship as between an apple and a banana between the two, because the Maoists of Nepal were homegrown. They were destructive, but they were not under any kind of influence from the north. But if there has been any adventurism on Nepal, which is not the topic of this session here, it has come from the south. But it doesn't mean that as China becomes more engaged in Nepal, that there won't be adventurism from the north as well. So Nepal has to prepare for both.
Just two questions real quickly. Why do you, on the panel, think that there's so little cooperation or knowledge exchange or students going back and forth between China and India? And then as part of that also, we've talked about the One Belt, One Road initiative. Why wasn't India included as part of that? You've got Pakistan, but why wasn't that more of an integral part of another partner that you'd want to include? Thank you.
We've got a question over here.
Yeah, my name is Tom Kelly. China has increased its military presence, its naval presence throughout the Indian Ocean and on the periphery of the Indian Ocean. It's recently opened a fairly large naval base in Djibouti with a prospect for other bases potentially opening in places like Tanzania, Pakistan, Maldives, and elsewhere. My question for Dr. Menon is, how is India going to respond to that?
Thank you. My name is Eugene. I work at the RAND Corporation. My question is to Dr. Menon.
Thanks for the doctorate, by the way.
When you look at the relationship between the United States and China, you see that U.S. has developed a number of mechanisms within the American government to deal with China. So there is extensive coordination between different departments. There is a China desk officer in most ministries. There is some coordination at the level of National Security Council and so forth. So if you could briefly talk about where is the China expertise concentrated within the Indian government, and whether there is good interdepartmental cooperation and on the China issue. Thank you.
A question here before we go back to the panel.
David Carl with Get Global. Question to Ambassador Menon.
Your doctorate has
Dr. Ambassador Menon. You mentioned the need to build a new modus vivendi, to build for a new future. How confident are you that the current governments in both countries, are capable of such an exercise and are interested in such an exercise?
Dr. Ron, you want to talk about the Belt and Road?
Yeah, pick up one. Let me just say this. The Belt and Road Initiative does not exclude India. As a matter of fact, from the day one, we are pretty open and inclusive, invite India to be part of this. On one hand, China has a Pakistan economic corridor. On the other hand, we propose the BCIM, China, India, Bangladesh, India, China, and Myanmar, and all this. So this is also a corridor. But however, for quite obvious reasons, the BCIM has go pretty slow. So China does not exclude anyone. We like to invite India to be part of this. So the ball is on the India's court, actually. Thank you.
How confident am I that the governments can do this? Not very, but you know, I think, but that's because I'm a private citizen now. No, the fact is the effort is worth making, because in the process of trying to do this, you will go through the issues that actually concern you. You will also get a much better understanding of each other, of where you are, and presumably as a result, you will deal better with the situations that do arise. Do we have mechanisms? We have mechanisms where we can do precisely this. We have a strategic dialogue, which is run by the NSAs on both sides, or the NSA and the State Council on the Chinese side, NSA on our side. Traditionally, we have a strategic economic dialogue, which at a very high level, we have a whole set of mechanisms related to the border and to maintaining peace on the border, all the way from flag meetings, local commanders, all the way up. And we have we've had a regular series of summits between the leaders, which I think and because the preparations for that actually have helped to deal with many of these things. But you know, any mechanism, that's the form. It's only as good as the substance that you're both willing to put into it and the amount of effort that you actually bring to the table. What are we going to do about China's naval presence, Djibouti, possible other bases, Gwadar, Hambantota, and so on? Because many of these ports don't seem to make economic sense. And so at some stage, whoever's built it is going to have to justify it. And maybe the easiest justification is, say, put the Navy there. What are we going to do about it? The fact is that both India and China are much more active, not just in the Indian Ocean, but also in the oceans up to the Western Pacific. As I said, the ocean is not an exclusive space. Each side builds up capabilities to protect what it sees as its interests, which so far are really maintaining freedom of navigation, security in these sea lanes. And I think we'll do that. This is why I think we need a dialogue, because we need to see what worries. We have worked together, actually, off the Horn of Africa and off Aden when it came to counter-piracy. We have actually, both of us have had task forces there, and they've both cooperated quite successfully in the past. But that isn't the same as actually discussing maritime security in a structured way and seeing what bothers each of us and what missions we think we are there to perform. That's a much more complex exercise, and I think we need to do that. India herself has, over the last, well, now I would say about 10 to 12 years, has actually developed a much more active presence in the entire region, and starting with maritime domain awareness all the way up through search and rescue, cooperation with the other states in the region, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Seychelles, Mauritius, and so on. Same thing, Bay of Bengal, we have an initiative going. I think it started really with piracy off Malacca when we worked with Singapore and Malaysia and the others to deal with it. And ever since then, I think that's been growing as well. But you know, this is normal. This is part of us developing our capabilities and protecting these expanding interests that I spoke about at the beginning. And I think we have to accept that this is going to change, that the Indian Ocean is still different from, well, the Western Pacific, from the seas near China, in terms of both its geography and also in terms of the security issues there. And I think they're still at an incipient stage where if we start talking about and dealing with them together cooperatively, at this stage we probably have a better chance of dealing with it and preventing it becoming an acute problem.
Since the question referred to the US-India interface in relation to China, let me share with you how I think it has impacted us on the ground in Kathmandu. Now, Nepal is a country that has been going through a lot of turmoil, and it's all we can do to keep our civil society intact, democracy on track, etc., because there are just too too much turbulence. In that context, the United States has always been actually a positive presence in the last 2 decades in relation to human rights, development activities, grassroots empowerment, the kind of things which are not seen through strategic eyes, but purely helping Nepal out. What has changed in the last few years, as it seems to us from the Kathmandu perspective, and this might also relate to some of the experiences in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as well. What it seems on the ground, we see that the US Embassy has essentially evolved, in my view, into a cultural entity, rather than being there as a diplomatic presence. And there seems to have been a kind of an outsourcing of Nepal policy to New Delhi. Why? And this may be a bit of an exaggeration, but this is how it seems on the ground, because the shoe pinches there at that point. It may be that in order to countenance China's rise, the US and India now have concerns that are common, and so they have decided to work it out. And in that context, it seems to me that there's some kind of outsourcing going on Nepal policy to New Delhi from Washington, D.C.
Somebody forgot to tell Delhi.
I was going to say it probably looks very different from Delhi, where there's complaining of a different sort. You can always tell that there, with China-India panels, that you can discuss a lot, but we haven't even got to the China-India economic relationship, which has been growing, but also with it, friction has been growing. That's for perhaps next year. Thank you all. I know there are a lot more questions. Please grab the panelists after and ask them there. We've just run out of time, so sorry about that. And thank you all again. And thank you to the panelists.